You were never supposed to know what lay beneath the quiet soil of Tuam. Not you, not me, not anyone outside the walls of the Mother and Baby Home. But secrets, no matter how deep they are buried, ratand when they rot, they rise. Imagine this: you are a child, walking through an overgrown field behind an old building, when your foot catches on something hard, something that should not be there. You dig, just a little, and what you find is not earth, not stone, but bone. Small bone. Fragile bone. The kind that should belong to a child. That image is where our story begins, not with records, not with officials, not with polite history books, but with a hole in the ground and the whispered panic of two children who saw too much. For decades, the Tuam home was a place where young, unmarried mothers were sent in shame, their babies taken from them in the name of purity and morality. The priests and nuns ran it like a machine, cold and efficient, turning human lives into statistics, scandals into silence. But what happened to the babies who never left alive? The official numbers are there, in black and white. 796 infants dead. No burial records, no coffins, no marked graves. Just a spike in death rates that no one in authority dared to question. And then came the discovery of the tunnels, the old septic tanks. The network that should have carried away waste, but instead may have carried away human remains. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is a crime scene that was paved over, blessed, and forgotten until people like Catherine Corliss refused to let it stay buried. Tonight, we are not just recounting what happened. We are entering the maze itself, following every clue, every blueprint, every testimony that points to what really happened behind those walls. The deeper we go, the darker it gets, because this is not just a story about a single home in Ireland. It is a story about power, control, and the system that decided which lives mattered and which lives could be erased. I need you to stay with me, stay focused, because once you hear what lies at the end of this trail, you will never look at the world the same way again. The first real crack in the wall came from an unlikely place. A historian, a quiet woman who simply wanted answers. Catherine Corliss sat in her kitchen surrounded by birth and death certificates, trying to piece together a list of every child who had passed through the Tuam home. At first it was just research, a local history project. But the more she wrote, the more the numbers refused to line up. Hundreds of births, hundreds of deaths, no cemetery records, no graves. It was as if nearly 800 children had simply ceased to exist. Catherine did what the church, the state, and generations of locals had never dared to do. She asked where the bodies were. And when she asked, she was met with silence, deflection, and polite dismissal. But silence is an answer. Silence means you are close to something. Catherine followed that silence like a blood trail, and it led her to the old maps of the property. That's when she saw it. The septic system, the disused tanks, the hidden places on the grounds where no one ever went. Witness testimony began to surface. Children, now grown, who remembered playing near the tanks and seeing bones sticking out of the ground, tiny skulls staring back at them. Men who had worked construction on the site and hit bones with their shovels but were told to cover them and move on. The pattern was unmistakable. If the records said the babies died, but the records did not say where they were buried, and the ground itself was quietly giving up their remains, then the conclusion was simple and horrifying. The missing children of Tuam were still there, beneath the earth, packed into a pit where waste should have gone, not human life. And the question that follows is the one that haunts every person who hears this story. How could this have been allowed to happen? How many people knew? How many looked away? And was this just Tuam, or was it everywhere? This is where the descent begins, because to face these questions is to face not just one building, but an entire system built to erase the inconvenient, the unwanted, the illegitimate. You cannot confront Tuam without confronting the power that created it. And that power does not like being named. Picture this. Beneath the peaceful grass of the Tuam site lies a hidden network that was never meant to see daylight again. Archaeologists describe it as a maze tunnels of red brick, 2 meters high and 1 meter wide, the kind you could walk through standing upright. They were not designed for burial, they were designed for sewage, but what they have become is something closer to catacombs. When the ground-penetrating scans were done, the results were undeniable. Little red spots lit up across the map, marking anomalies exactly where witnesses said they saw bones decades earlier. Each red spot was a question, each one a possible grave. It was as if the earth itself was screaming, pointing to where the truth had been hidden. Archaeologist Tony Maguire, a veteran of uncovering mass graves, said the site was one of the clearest she had ever seen. She explained that if the grass was stripped back and the topsoil removed, you would see the outlines of the graves almost immediately, like footprints frozen in time. But there has never been a full excavation. The state, the church, the owners of the land, each one has hesitated, stalled, debated, delayed. Meanwhile, the ground keeps its silence, and the children remain below. This is what makes Tuam not just a story of past crimes, but a story of present injustice. Somewhere under that field are the remains of 796 children, maybe more. Some were infants only days old. Some were toddlers. Some may still have small bits of clothing clinging to their bones. And above them, life goes on as if nothing ever happened. Imagine standing there, on that ground, knowing what lies beneath your feet. The weight of that knowledge is unbearable. And yet, to look away is to become complicit in the same forgetting that allowed this to happen in the first place. What we are dealing with here is not just burial. It is erasure. A deliberate attempt to wipe these children from history, to turn them into nothing more than a line in a register. And if we do not speak of them, if we do not look for them, then the erasure succeeds. That is why we go deeper. That is why we keep digging, even when the truth is almost too heavy to bear. The physical graves are only half the crime. The other half is invisible, carved into the minds of the women who were sent to these homes. To understand Tuam, you have to understand the machine that fed it. A system of psychological control so powerful that it turned mothers into their own jailers. Young women, often still teenagers, were taken from their homes, some by choice, most by force, and placed inside high-walled institutions where every aspect of their existence was controlled. They were stripped of their names, called penitents, made to scrub floors, wash sheets, and work in silence as though their pregnancy was a crime they had to work off. They were told that they had sinned, that their children were a mark of shame, that they were lucky to even be allowed to give birth at all. Every day was a ritual of humiliation designed to break them down until they no longer believed they had a right to keep their baby. Imagine giving birth alone, in pain, with no family allowed to see you, no comforting voice except the cold commands of a nun. Then imagine that baby being taken from you within days or weeks, without explanation, without consent, untold you must sign papers relinquishing your child or face eternal damnation. The church called it salvation. The state called it rehabilitation. But to the women inside, it was a slow-motion theft of their lives. The fear of scandal kept families from fighting back. The fear of the church kept entire towns silent. And the fear of eternal punishment kept mothers compliant even as their hearts broke. This was psychological warfare disguised as morality, a system built to protect reputations, not children. And it worked so well that decades passed before anyone dared speak of what had been done. The shame was generational, passed from mother to daughter like a curse. That is why when we talk about Tuam, we are not just talking about bones under the ground, we are talking about thousands of women, living with a silence that has choked them for half a century. Breaking that silence is dangerous, but it is also the only way to break the spell that kept this system alive. Her name was Terry, and her story shatters whatever illusions we might still hold about choice or consent. In 1972, she was just 18 when she discovered she was pregnant. Her family's response was not compassion but exile. She was sent to an aunt in England to hide the disgrace. For a brief moment, she thought she might escape the grip of Ireland's moral machine. But escape was an illusion. One afternoon, she returned to her aunt's house to find 2 members of the clergy waiting for her in the kitchen. They told her she was going back to Ireland. There was no discussion, no explanation, no permission asked. She was escorted to a plane like a criminal and flown back against her will. Her destination was Bessborough, one of the most notorious mother and baby homes in the country. A massive building isolated by trees, where young women were deposited like unwanted property. Terry describes being driven up a long road, seeing the giant doors, the stone steps, the bleakness of it all, and feeling as though she was being swallowed alive. Inside, she was locked in, cut off from the world, and told to work until she gave birth. She had no lawyer, no advocate, no way out. When her son was born, she held him for 6 days. 6 days that would be the last time she ever saw him. Then came the papers. The nuns told her she had no choice. If she wanted to leave, she had to sign. If she wanted to be forgiven, she had to let him go. Under duress, she signed, and her baby was sold for adoption. Terry escaped later, but her life was permanently scarred, and she never got her son back. There are tens of thousands of stories just like hers. Mothers whose children were taken and sent to America or to wealthy Irish families. Part of an industry that made the religious orders wealthy while telling society they were doing God's work. Terry calls it what it was: kidnapping, trafficking, the theft of a generation. When you hear her voice shake with rage as she names the priests and nuns who orchestrated this, you begin to realize Tuam was not an accident. It was an economy, a system, and it devoured the powerless, while everyone else looked away. Follow the money, and the pattern becomes undeniable. The mother and baby homes were not just moral prisons, they were profit centers. Every child that passed through their gates was turned into currency. Wealthy families, particularly from America, paid donations to adopt Irish babies, often without ever meeting the mothers or even stepping foot in the country. The nuns called it charity, but the sums involved tell another story: hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds per child, at a time when many Irish workers earned a fraction of that in a year. The state turned a blind eye, the church pocketed the money, and the mothers were given nothing but a memory and a scar. These were not legal adoptions in the way we think of today, where the welfare of the child is considered. These were transactions, executed swiftly, with forged signatures or coerced consent. The paperwork was often incomplete or deliberately altered, erasing the mother's identity and severing the bloodline forever. Decades later, when these children, now adults, went searching for their origins, they hit a wall of missing records, destroyed files, and institutions that claimed they could not help. This was by design. The economic model depended on secrecy, on making sure the mothers had no legal claim, no way to retrieve what was stolen. And so, every piece of this machine was calibrated. The shaming of the mother ensured compliance. The isolation of the home ensured silence. And the financial incentive ensured the church had every reason to keep the machine running. When you understand this, you begin to see why there was never a public outcry, why the deaths of hundreds of children could pass without investigation. The church was not just a spiritual authority. It was one of the wealthiest landowners and power brokers in the country, and no politician dared confront it. What was being sold here was not just babies, it was absolution. A way for respectable society to cleanse itself of scandal while quietly filling the coffers of the very institutions that had created the problem in the first place. And the cost was paid by those who could least afford it. Poor women, their children, and the generations of families who were fractured by this system. It started with whispers, the kind that passed through a village like smoke, clinging to everything and never truly leaving. Locals in Tuam remembered the small white coffins, sometimes carried out at dawn, sometimes not at all. Children growing up near the home would see tiny shapes wrapped in sacks, lowered into the ground behind the high walls, or hear the nuns reciting hurried prayers over open pits. But no one dared to speak loudly. Fear was the air they breathed. The church was everywhere, its priests in the pulpit on Sunday, its nuns running schools and hospitals, its reach stretching into every house through guilt and obligation. Mothers who dared question where their child was buried were silenced with scripture and shame. When neighbors asked too many questions, they were reminded that this was God's work and that to interfere would be to sin. For decades, this conspiracy of silence held firm until the land itself began to betray the secret. In the 1970s, local boys playing near the derelict home discovered a concrete slab that rang hollow when struck. They pried it open and found what they thought were small skulls staring back at them from the darkness below. The adults came, covered the hole, and told the children to forget what they had seen. But the memory stuck like a thorn. This was the first fracture in the wall of silence. The first sign that what lay beneath Tuam was far darker than anyone had imagined. Even then, the authorities treated it as an inconvenience rather than a crime. They logged the discovery but never excavated the ground, never catalogued the remains, never informed the public. The story was buried again, just like the children. This cycle of discovery and denial repeated itself over and over for years, each time reinforcing the sense that what was hidden here was too terrible, too destabilizing to be faced. It was not until Catherine Corliss, a local historian and dogged researcher, began digging into the death records decades later that the scale of the horror became undeniable. She found 796 death certificates for children associated with the home, but no burial records, no graves that matched. The question became impossible to ignore. Where were the bodies? Catherine Corliss was not a politician or a journalist, just a local woman with a stubborn sense that the past needed to be accounted for. She had grown up in Tuam, had seen the children from the home walking to school in tattered clothes, heads shaved, treated like outcasts. Something about their absence in later years gnawed at her, and when the building was finally demolished, she could not shake the feeling that their stories had been erased. She began visiting archives, parish records, and county registries, piecing together scraps of paper that no one had bothered to connect. What she found was chilling. Between 1925 and 1961, nearly 800 children died at the Tuam Mother and Baby Home. They died of malnutrition, measles, convulsions, tuberculosis, causes of death that in a properly funded and humane environment would have been preventable. But there were no individual graves, no markers, no acknowledgement of their existence. Callers traced the outlines of the old property, compared them with death records, and reached a horrifying conclusion. The children had been buried on site, en masse, in unmarked ground. She wrote article after article, pleading for someone in authority to listen. But for years she was dismissed as exaggerating, as stirring up old wounds that were better left closed. Even some neighbors told her to stop, that it was dangerous to go against the church. But she refused to let go. Finally, in 2014, her research broke into the national media. The Irish government was forced to acknowledge what was now undeniable: the possibility of a mass grave containing hundreds of children. Excavations soon confirmed it. Under what had once been a sewage treatment chamber, investigators found human remains, small bones, tiny skulls, layer upon layer, dating back to the years the home was in operation. The truth had been literally buried under the most degrading place imaginable: a sewage tank, as though the children had been treated as waste. This revelation shocked not just Ireland but the entire world, igniting outrage and demands for accountability. Yet even then, the church remained cautious, issuing carefully worded statements of sorrow, but never admitting direct wrongdoing. The state called for inquiries, commissions, and reports, but justice for the dead remained elusive. When the story broke, Ireland was forced to confront a truth it had long buried along with the children. The government launched an official inquiry, the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, tasked with uncovering what had happened not only in Tuam but in dozens of similar institutions across the country. As hearings began, survivors came forward to testify, women, now in their 70s and 80s, who had carried the weight of their trauma in silence for decades. Their voices were steady but carried a lifetime of pain. They spoke of being locked away for becoming pregnant, of being told they were sinners unworthy of redemption, of working in laundries for no pay while their babies were taken from them. They remembered hearing the cries of sick infants at night, the silence that followed, the smell of lime as the earth was opened again and again. The testimonies painted a picture of systemic cruelty so vast that it could not be explained away as a few bad actors. This was a machine that spanned generations, fueled by religious control, societal complicity, and state endorsement. As the evidence mounted, the Irish public began to ask dangerous questions. How could this have been allowed to happen for so long? Who knew and who profited? The answer was unsettling. Politicians, police, doctors, priest, soul had played a part, whether through active participation or willful ignorance. The Commission's reports detailed not just neglect but the deliberate concealment of deaths, the falsification of records, and the destruction of evidence. The image of Ireland as a pious, morally upright nation cracked under the weight of these revelations. And yet, even as the truth surfaced, there were attempts to contain it. Some archives remained sealed, citing privacy concerns. Some religious orders refused to open their books fully or to pay compensation to survivors. It became clear that the battle for justice was not just about finding the bones. It was about forcing powerful institutions to admit that their hands were covered in centuries of blood. This was not just a local scandal. It was a blueprint for how control systems operate. Shame the vulnerable, exploit them, and bury the evidence when it becomes inconvenient. The survivors refused to let the story end with a report. They had been silent for too long, and now the silence was broken. They began marching, gathering in front of government buildings and church properties, holding photographs of the children who never had a chance to live beyond those walls. Their voices became a chorus of defiance, demanding not just acknowledgement, but justice, truth, reparations, and accountability. Activists joined their cause, turning Tuam into a symbol of Ireland's buried past. Candlelight vigils were held at the site, names of the dead read aloud, transforming the once forgotten ground into hallowed soil. The church, meanwhile, responded with calculated caution. Statements of deep sorrow were issued, carefully crafted to sound contrite, while avoiding admission of legal responsibility. The government promised redress schemes, but the process was slow, bureaucratic, and for many survivors, insulting. Some were offered token sums of money for years of unpaid labor and lifelong trauma, a gesture that felt more like hush money than justice. As pressure mounted, more records were unsealed, and the picture grew darker. Tuam was not an anomaly. Across Ireland, in places like Bessborough, Sean Ross, Abbey, and Castle Pollard, similar graves were suspected or confirmed. This was a national network, an industrial-scale system of confinement, coercion, and concealment. International media picked up the story, turning global attention on Ireland's reckoning. The narrative shifted from isolated tragedy to systemic abuse. This was no longer just a scandal of the past. It was a living wound, still bleeding in the present. And yet, even as light was finally being shown on this dark history, there were efforts to dilute it, to control the narrative, to ensure that the blame did not land too heavily on the institutions that still held power. This is where you, the viewer, step deeper into this forbidden history. What happened in Tuam was not just a crime, it was a mirror, showing us what happens when a society trades truth for obedience, when it allows moral authority to become untouchable. If you are still here, still listening, you are part of this descent with me. And I want you to comment below. I will not look away twice. Not just to boost this video, but to mark your choice to refuse to turn your head like generations before us did. To understand Tuam, you must first understand fear dressed as duty, obedience disguised as morality. From the moment a young mother entered the walls of the home, her mind was reshaped, her will subjugated. Rules were not suggestions, they were iron chains, reinforced by constant surveillance, public humiliation, and whispered threats that stretched beyond the walls. The nuns acted as both caretakers and jailers, wielding psychological instruments honed over decades. A mother who resisted was shamed, labeled unfit, her pleas dismissed as selfishness or sin. Isolation was another weapon. Girls were cut off from their families, monitored day and night, forbidden to speak freely, forced to internalize guilt for desires that were natural and human. And while the mothers suffered, the children became pawns in a larger, hidden operation. Records were altered, births unregistered, identities erased. The church and state conspired in silence, creating a fog where accountability could never penetrate. The very architecture of these homes reinforced control. High walls, locked doors, narrow corridors, and hidden staircases that led to rooms where confessions, punishments, and decisions about life and death were made. Ordinary citizens, neighbors, and even local authorities often turned a blind eye, conditioned by decades of religious indoctrination and fear of reprisal. Tuam was a laboratory of submission, a place where obedience was not voluntary, it was a matter of survival. Every day, children were fed, clothed, and educated only to the extent that it ensured their compliance, to make them invisible witnesses to the machinery of secrecy. And when death claimed the youngest, the institution's solution was burial in secrecy, in disused septic tanks, hidden graves. Tunnel's efforts, meticulously designed to erase proof and deny the mothers the most basic human closure. This is how a system, seemingly benevolent in public, could commit atrocities in private. By controlling thought, movement, and emotion, they manufactured complicity. And here is the terrifying truth. Systems like these exist not just in history, they exist wherever power is unchecked, wherever fear is weaponized, wherever morality is outsourced to those who demand obedience. By understanding the psychological architecture of Tuam, you can see the mechanisms at work that allowed hundreds of children to vanish and the survivors to endure, silenced. This is a warning and a revelation. And now, I want to ask you, wherever you are watching from, comment below. Tell me, from where are you watching? This simple act connects you to the global awareness of crimes hidden in plain sight and marks your presence in uncovering history's dark truths. Beneath the manicured lawns, beneath the ordinary buildings of Tuam, lay secrets buried in plain sight. The bodies of children, too young to understand the cruelty of the world, were hidden in layers of brick, soil, and secrecy. The disused septic tanks, once mundane parts of infrastructure, became clandestine tombs. Imagine a network of tunnels, 2 meters high, 1 meter wide, constructed in red brick, silent witnesses to horror. No official records, no public markers, just a maze designed to hide what no one wanted the world to see. Franny and Marie, children themselves, stumbled upon this darkness decades ago, their eyes widening in disbelief as they saw the first signs of a reality too terrible to name. Their testimony was dismissed, minimized, and nearly erased, as though the world could not bear to acknowledge the crime. Yet the evidence was tangible. Layers of sediment, the architectural traces of tunnels leading to hidden pits, and the faint impression of small coffins beneath the earth. Tony Maguire, the archaeologist who would later expose the scale of the horror, scanned the grounds with equipment that revealed anomalies beneath the surface, red dots that marked where hundreds of children had been buried. Each dot a child, a life stolen, a story denied. The system that allowed this was both simple and diabolical. Maintain appearances, control the narrative, erase documentation, intimidate witnesses, and discredit the few who dared speak. Those who should have protected these children, the state, the authorities, the clergy, chose complicity over justice. The horror is amplified by the banality of its concealment. A mother visiting a home, thinking her child safe, could never imagine the same walls would later be a tomb. Ordinary people walked above graves without noticing, the ground beneath their feet hiding the unimaginable, and the psychological manipulation extended beyond the dead. Mothers were coerced into giving up children, adoption papers signed under duress, the removal framed as moral salvation, a path to redemption for women deemed sinful. The living and the dead were both victims of a meticulously orchestrated system. And while decades passed, the graves remained untouched, almost invisible. But truth has a way of resurfacing. Today, every scan, every testimony, every piece of documentation builds the picture of a crime long denied. You are witnessing the evidence that was never meant to be seen. Proof of atrocities hidden by layers of bureaucracy, faith, and fear. Take a moment and let it sink in. The ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, and in Tuam it concealed death on an industrial scale. The mothers, young and frightened, were the first victims of the system before their children ever knew the world. They were sent away from their families, isolated in buildings surrounded by high walls, under the watchful eyes of nuns whose authority was absolute. Terry's story is just one of countless examples. 18 years old, already branded as transgressive by society, hunted by relatives and authorities alike, and forcibly returned to Ireland under the guise of rescue. The psychological machinery at work was ruthless. Shame, fear, and obedience intertwined into a cage no one could see. Once inside, the women were stripped of autonomy. Clothes, possessions, even the right to decide their daily routine were controlled. They were taught that their children were burdens, sins incarnate, and that giving them up for adoption was the only path to redemption. In reality, it was a system built for profit and secrecy. Adoption papers were not agreements but instruments of compliance, signed under coercion, often without legal counsel or informed consent. For many, resistance was futile. Letters sent home were intercepted, visitors were restricted, and whispers of punishment, both spiritual and physical, ensured obedience. Some mothers were moved from one facility to another, like Terry, who, after escaping Bessborough, was captured again and confined in Dublin. Her son, Niall, born amid fear and deprivation, was taken within days, leaving a void that could never be filled. Behind closed doors, the nuns and officials orchestrated a trafficking network that stretched beyond Ireland, sending children to families overseas, cloaked in the language of charity and salvation. It was a business of life and death disguised as morality, where every act of compassion was perverted into a tool of control. The psychological manipulation did not end with adoption. It seeped into memory, shaping how women remembered their children, their experiences, their own worth. Generations were haunted not only by absence but by the relentless internalized guilt, as if society had succeeded in convincing them that they had failed. This control system operated in silence, invisible to the world outside, yet insidious, thorough, and enduring. And while decades have passed, the wounds have never healed. Some mothers died carrying secrets that the world refused to acknowledge. Today, every testimony, every scanned grave, every historical record unearthed is a rebellion against that enforced silence. And you, listening now, are part of the reckoning, witnessing what was long suppressed. The machinery of fear and obedience that once trapped these women is laid bare, exposing a calculated architecture of suffering. Ask yourself, how many truths remain buried, not just in the earth of Tuam, but in every system that preys on the vulnerable? And if the machinery could reach these women, how far could it have reached, silently shaping lives and erasing identities? Beneath the surface of Tuam, beneath the manicured grass and stone pathways, the earth holds secrets that no official record dared to admit. Archaeologist Tony Maguire's scans revealed anomalies where walls of red brick had once formed septic tanks, abandoned and forgotten by time but never by memory. These tanks, now empty shells, were the final resting place for hundreds of children. Infants who never saw the light of day outside the walls of the home. The dimensions of the tunnels were suffocating, yet calculated, 2 meters high. 1 meter wide, enough for an adult to walk, yet narrow enough to ensure the secrecy of what passed through them. Red brick walls, damp and crumbling, form corridors reminiscent of catacombs, eerily silent except for the whispers of history that cling to their mortar. Each pit, each anomaly on the scan, represents a life erased, a story intentionally buried to protect the reputation of an institution above the welfare of its charges. Tony's expertise in clandestine burials, honed in Belfast's secret mass graves, provided a chilling confirmation. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic concealments. Footprints, disturbed soil, the faint outlines of tiny coffins. These are markers of a truth that decades of bureaucracy tried to obscure. Locals spoke of children disappearing without explanation, of grief silenced by fear, and of warnings whispered to any who dared probe too closely. Yet, as the scans demonstrated, evidence cannot be hidden forever. The anomalies traced by Maguire are more than geological curiosities. They are signatures of atrocity, left by hands that believed they were acting righteously, but whose morality was warped by power and dogma. Excavation, she explained, would immediately reveal graves, small coffins stacked in clusters, unmistakable in their pattern. But years of institutional inertia, combined with societal denial, meant that even the most basic scientific verification was delayed, resisted, and trivialized. The mass grave of Tuam is both a physical location and a symbol, a testament to how ideology can justify cruelty, and how bureaucracy can protect perpetrators while silencing victims. Each brick, each layer of soil, each anomaly is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it hides quietly, sanctioned by authority, waiting for those brave enough to expose it. And now, as you listen, you are standing at the threshold of that revelation, peering into a past the world tried to forget, forced to confront the uncomfortable fact that innocence was traded for secrecy. And the only witnesses left are the earth itself and those who refuse to be silenced. This is not a story of speculation. It is forensic truth intertwined with human memory, and every detail uncovered deepens the moral abyss into which these children were cast. The survivors of Tuam speak in voices that tremble with memory and rage, a mixture of sorrow and defiance that decades of silence could not extinguish. Each testimony peels back another layer of the home's suffocating control, exposing a network of psychological manipulation designed to break not just bodies, but spirits. They remember being herded like livestock, ordered to obey without question, punished for the smallest infractions, and humiliated for their very existence. Mothers who dared ask questions were silenced, shamed, or sent away, while children were stripped of identity, given numbers instead of names, and conditioned to internalize the blame for their suffering. Terry's story, like countless others, is a chilling blueprint of coercion. Kidnapped from the safety of her aunt's home, forced into isolation at Besborough, and denied the right to keep her newborn son. She embodies the institutional cruelty cloaked in morality. The nuns claimed salvation, yet delivered dispossession. Signatures were coerced under duress, adoption papers signed through intimidation, and every act framed as benevolence, while functioning as trafficking sanctioned by both church and state. Survivors recall the chilling rituals, the way the home imposed silence with threats of divine wrath, embedding fear so deeply that even families became complicit, too terrified to intervene. These women, and the children whose lives were stolen before they began, reveal a pattern of systemic abuse where power was absolute, unchallenged, and protected by a veil of social conformity. The trauma extended far beyond the walls. The stolen infants, sold to families in Ireland and abroad, carried the weight of unknown origins, the absence of maternal bonds, and the cultural stigma of illegitimacy imposed by a society obsessed with purity. Catherine Corliss, the local historian, brought names to the anonymous bodies, restoring identity where bureaucracy had erased it. Each name inscribed on her painstaking records is a testament to defiance, a reclamation of history, a challenge to the narrative that sought to bury the truth along with the children. And yet, despite evidence, despite testimony, the machinery of denial continues. Official commissions move slowly, as if uncertainty can cleanse culpability, and religious institutions maintain control over the narrative, preserving a carefully curated reputation while survivors are left to navigate the wreckage of stolen lives. As you hear these accounts, understand that you are entering a world where authority masks atrocity, where silence becomes complicity, and where the voices of the oppressed claw through decades of denial to demand recognition. It is not only a story of what happened in Tuam, but a mirror of the mechanisms that allow corruption to thrive in every institution cloaked in moral righteousness. This is the human cost of secrets, and now, as you watch, you bear witness by behind the walls of Tuam, the shadow of complicity stretches far beyond the convent gates. The nuns were not acting in isolation. They were part of a web of political, religious, and social forces that protected, justified, and concealed their actions. Documents, carefully archived yet conveniently inaccessible, reveal local authorities turning blind eyes, approving construction projects on mass graves, and granting licenses that legitimized control over the lives of vulnerable women and children. Each bureaucratic signature is a seal of silent consent, each official report a layer of erasure. The Irish state, ostensibly the protector of its citizens, often functioned as the enabler of systemic exploitation, ensuring that inconvenient truths were buried alongside innocent lives. For decades, the machinery of power maintained an unbroken narrative. These were homes for the morally fallen, a moral crusade justified under the guise of charity, morality, and divine order. Yet beneath the rhetoric, there was commerçant, organized, profitable trafficking of children that enriched religious orders and maintained social hierarchies. Families were coerced, mothers intimidated, and children vanished into a system designed to erase identity, memory, and accountability. Survivors recount subtle and overt threats, the imposition of silence enforced not just with fear of punishment, but with the threat of spiritual condemnation, of eternal shame, of being erased from society's moral ledger. Letters written by mothers and never answered, petitions for justice that were buried in offices, and whispers of wrongdoing in small villages paint a chilling portrait of institutionalized protection. Even journalists were blocked, foreign media warned away, and local witnesses silenced, creating a culture of enforced amnesia. Catherine Corliss's work exposed the fault lines in this network: historical records, baptismal registers, and oral histories combined to reveal 795 children whose names had been forgotten, lives that had been erased. Yet despite undeniable evidence, the state hesitated, commissions were slow to form, and reparations remained a distant promise. Tuam becomes not just a story of tragedy, but a case study in how power, morality, and bureaucracy intersect to conceal the worst human impulses. When you look at this system, understand that silence is a tool as potent as violence. That complicity is a force stronger than fear, and that revelation requires courage from those willing to challenge both sacred and secular authority. Now, as we descend further into the labyrinth of Tuam, ask yourself, how many institutions around the world operate under the same unchallenged assumption? hiding crimes behind moral facades, awaiting only exposure to crumble. This is the moment where history stops being distant and begins to speak directly to you, demanding attention, judgment, and a reckoning that still has not come. Beneath the overgrown grass of Tuam, beneath the soil compacted by decades of indifference, lie secrets that resist light and memory. Archaeologists and forensic experts approach the site with a mix of awe and dread, understanding that each scan, each probe, could confirm the unimaginable. Hundreds of children hidden beneath the ground, their presence recorded only in whispers and censored documents. Tony Maguire's scans reveal anomalies in the earth, irregularities that suggest voids, tunnels, and burial pits. These are not simple graves. They are clandestine chambers, constructed to erase existence while keeping control. Red brick tunnels, 2 meters high, 1 meter wide, snake beneath the site, evidence of planning, methodical execution, and chilling intent. It was here that witnesses like Franny and Marie glimpsed what no child should ever see: remains, bones, and tiny coffins, glimpses of a horror carefully concealed for generations. Scientific verification brings a terrifying clarity. Ground-penetrating radar confirms the presence of underground cavities and soil disturbances consistent with burials. Every anomaly corresponds to a story, every hollow a life erased. Families who were told their children had been sent away for adoption now confront a truth far darker. Some were never meant to leave this earth alive. The process was deliberate. Earth moved, tunnels maintained, and entrances concealed to ensure that the children would vanish from memory, from society, and from justice. Each finding connects to testimony. Each scan corroborates decades-old accounts, ignored or dismissed. Yet even with forensic evidence, accountability remains elusive. Local authorities, clergy, and governments hesitated, some still denying the scope of what occurred. The site itself becomes a character, a silent witness, speaking through anomalies and soil samples, demanding recognition. When you trace the pathways of these hidden tunnels, you realize the meticulous cruelty. Children were not only confined in life, but erased in death, their resting places chosen for secrecy, not sanctity. These discoveries force a confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that societal and institutional power can be weaponized to erase, and that corruption can cloak itself in piety. As we peer into these underground chambers, the weight of every life lost presses upon us, urging acknowledgement, remembrance, and justice. Tuam is not simply a site. It is a monument to hidden atrocity, a testimony to the dark efficiency of organized secrecy, and a call to never allow history's most vulnerable to vanish silently again. This is where morality, law, and human decency intersect or fail. The mothers of Tuam were the first victims, their anguish hidden behind the walls of convents and bureaucratic indifference. Young, often unmarried, and desperate, they were systematically stripped of autonomy, herded into mother and baby homes under the guise of moral rescue. Terry's story is not an anomaly. It is emblematic. At 18, she fled her family, seeking refuge in England, only to be forcibly returned, kidnapped under the authority of the Rescue Crusade, a so-called charitable organization sanctioned by church and state alike. Behind closed doors, she encountered the machinery of control, nuns trained in psychological manipulation, clerics who wielded doctrine like a weapon, and social workers who acted as agents of surveillance rather than protection. Once inside Besborough, Terry was isolated, her movements restricted, her rights stripped. She was not just detained, she was erased. The birth of her son became an orchestrated transaction, her consent coerced, her grief silenced. Within months, 35,000 other children would meet similar fates, adopted away for profit, their existence commodified by religious congregations. The scale of this operation is staggering, yet it was cloaked in silence, sanctified by social norms that demanded shame from women and obedience to church authority. Ireland, still steeped in Catholic orthodoxy, offered little recourse. Families were complicit, coerced, or silenced. Neighbors whispered but dared not act. State mechanisms turned a blind eye. Terry's courage, however, carved cracks into this armor of secrecy. She resisted, she spoke, she attempted escape. Yet even when she defied the system, it pursued her, remanding her into other institutions, enforcing adoption against her will, ensuring that the machinery of control remained unbroken. This is not simply a story of individual cruelty. It is the blueprint of systemic oppression, where morality, religion, and state converge to suppress, exploit, and erase. Each mother's despair, each stolen child, is a testament to institutionalized power bent toward dominance rather than care. And yet, even decades later, the echoes of their suffering persist. Legal redress is slow, often symbolic. Acknowledgement is partial. The church remains a towering, almost untouchable authority. These women, these mothers, became ghosts in their own homeland, navigating grief compounded by shame, secrecy, and complicity. The truth of Tuam is not merely historical, it's structural, a chilling lesson in how society can normalize cruelty, how institutions can bend law and conscience toward control, and how power, unchecked, can erase generations. The voices of the mothers demand to be heard, but they are muffled by decades of silence, by the very systems that claimed their children, the children of Tuam. Small and silent, became the most tragic casualties of this system, their lives reduced to numbers, their deaths hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic complicity and institutional secrecy. They were not simply neglected, they were erased. Franny and Marie, decades later, would stumble upon a reality that many in Ireland would prefer to ignore: the network of tunnels, the disused septic tanks, the red brick chambers where tiny bodies were buried, hidden from the world. These were not accidental graves, but meticulously concealed mass burials, evidence of a crime that combined neglect, profit, and fear. The tunnels, 2 meters high and 1 meter wide, were almost ceremonial in their horror, allowing nuns and staff to move the dead children out of sight, out of mind, and into the earth where no one would question the absence. Archaeologist Tony Maguire's scans revealed anomalous small red spots beneath the surface, a silent confirmation that thousands of children had been interred in secrecy. These scientific revelations corroborated decades of testimony, of whispered stories, of local knowledge dismissed as rumor. Each scan, each tiny anomaly, is a fingerprint of systemic violence, a mark of a society that allowed innocence to be stolen under the guise of morality. Families were told to leave their children, coerced by shame, threatened by social condemnation, and convinced that the church's authority was absolute. And yet, even when evidence emerged, when bones were unearthed, and history threatened exposure, the response was bureaucratic erasure, holes filled, records ignored, approvals granted to build over graves, and a silence enforced by fear and complicity. These children, unnamed, became shadows, their lives reduced to anonymous spaces in the earth, their deaths sanitized by those who profited from their absence. The mass grave is more than a physical location. It is a symbol of a society's moral collapse, of a system that allowed sacred authority to override human decency. In the cold, damp chambers beneath Tuam, there is a lesson about power, about silence, and about the ways institutions protect themselves at the expense of the most vulnerable. This is forbidden knowledge, a truth too uncomfortable for many to confront, yet impossible to ignore once glimpsed. Each child, each testimony, each scanned anomaly forces us to ask, how far will authority go to conceal its sins? How many innocents must suffer before the world acknowledges what has been done? The missing children of Tuam are not just victims of neglect, they are the silent witnesses of a system built on secrecy, obedience, and unchallenged power. And their story demands that we do not turn away. Even decades later, the echoes of Tuam refuse to fade. The mass graves are not simply relics of a forgotten past. They are living wounds on the conscience of a nation. Catherine Corliss, a quiet historian with relentless resolve, began piecing together birth records, death certificates, and parish documents, stitching a tapestry of horror no one wanted to see. Each name, each entry, revealed a child lost, not to natural causes alone, but to an institutional machinery designed to profit from misery and enforce obedience. The Bon Secours sisters, charged with care yet enriched by suffering, ensured that records were incomplete, misleading, or destroyed, a deliberate effort to obscure the truth. Yet beneath the weight of decades, the truth persisted, creeping into public awareness like a shadow refusing to be ignored. Survivors of the mother and baby homes began to speak, one voice at a time, recounting forced separations, coerced adoptions, and the suffocating moralistic control imposed upon young mothers. Terry, one of these women, had her child taken 6 days after birth, her consent extracted under duress, her grief weaponized to maintain silence. The systemic cruelty was supported by a society where questioning the church was tantamount to moral betrayal. Governments provided minimal oversight, if any, while the clergy wielded authority over schools, hospitals, and social welfare, embedding psychological control deep within Irish life. Even now, more than 40 years later, the descendants of the stolen children search for answers. Their pursuit of justice impeded by bureaucracy, indifference, and the lingering shadows of ecclesiastical power. Archaeological studies, forensic analyses, and historical research converge to reveal what was once denied. The children were real. The graves are real, and the neglect and concealment were deliberate. And yet, attempts at accountability meet resistance. Commissions are slow, inquiries are stifled, and the public conversation is often drowned by claims of historical context or national shame. What emerges from Tuam is a chilling lesson in how power, cloaked in sanctity and righteousness, can silence voices, erase lives, and manipulate the very notion of morality. This is not just history. This is a warning. Each name unearthed, each grave identified, challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to face institutional failure, and to demand recognition for those who cannot speak. Comment below with the phrase, "Justice demands truth," twice, from where you are watching, and join this network of memory keepers. Only by naming what has been hidden can the forgotten begin to reclaim presence in our collective conscience. Tuam is not merely a story of loss, is a mirror of the dangers inherent when obedience is valued above humanity, when authority is unquestionable, and when morality is dictated by fear rather than compassion. Beneath the quiet fields of Tuam, beneath the flattened earth where children's bones lie in anonymity, there is a story of commerce disguised as charity. The mother and baby homes were not only instruments of control, they were businesses built on pain. The nuns, cloaked in sanctity, leveraged the desperation of young women to create a network of adoptions that spanned continents, selling children to Irish families who were often complicit in silence, and to foreign couples, mainly in the United States, who remained ignorant of the children's suffering. Each child taken from a mother represented a profit margin. Medical care, documentation, transportation, even coercion was monetized. Behind closed doors, infants and toddlers were warehoused like inventory, their lives catalogued and processed for the benefit of institutional enrichment. Yet this commerce was wrapped in a veneer of moral righteousness, a society convinced that unmarried mothers were sinners and that removing their children was a service to God and the community. The financial trail is labyrinthine, obscured by church authority, governmental negligence, and careful destruction of records. Invoices, ledgers, and correspondence reveal a chilling orchestration. Payments were made to secure adoptions. Donors contributed to the homes in good faith, and the states provided funding, turning ignorance into complicity. Survivors recount the emotional manipulation that underpinned every transaction. Mothers were shamed into compliance, coerced with threats of social ostracization or false legal claims. Their grief and loyalty weaponized to facilitate the movement of their children. The scope of exploitation is staggering. Thousands of children, removed without consent, were funneled into a system that treated them as commodities while their mothers were punished for their humanity. And yet, the architects of this system, clerics, administrators, and local officials, escape scrutiny, shielded by their positions and by a public unwilling to confront the magnitude of moral failure. Modern investigations revealed a chilling scale of this operation, connecting bureaucratic records to mass graves and to the dark financial underpinnings that ensured such atrocities could continue unchallenged. In uncovering these truths, we are confronted not only with the horror of lost lives, but with the deliberate, calculated structures of power that made the suffering profitable. The morality enforced by fear was intertwined with economic incentive, creating a system where compassion was irrelevant and accountability impossible. And as we peer deeper into Tuam, we must ask ourselves, how many institutions today operate on the same principles of concealed profit and moral corruption? How many stories of abuse remain buried beneath legality, religious sanction, or public indifference? Comment below from where you are watching and join the conversation about uncovering hidden systems that thrive on secrecy and suffering. Only through recognition and vigilance can history's darkness be illuminated. The human cost of Tuam is not measured in statistics alone. It is etched into the faces, memories, and silent anguish of the survivors. Every stolen child carries a shadow, every mother a wound that never healed. Terry's story, like so many others, illustrates the personal horror behind the systemic abuse. She was taken from her family under the guise of protection, transported across counties, stripped of agency, and forced into compliance by a combination of fear, coercion, and authority. Her infant son, Niall, was taken from her mere days after birth, signed away in documents she had no right to contest. This was repeated tens of thousands of times across Ireland. Children were moved like pawns, shuffled between homes, convents, and adoptive families. Often without records or explanation, their identities erased. Their lives controlled by institutions that claimed divine justification. Psychologists today describe the long-term trauma as intergenerational. Mothers carried guilt and grief silently, often never speaking of their children. Adopted children grappled with abandonment, identity crises, and a persistent, inexplicable sense of wrongness. Even the extended families were implicated, their social compliance manipulated to maintain secrecy. The institutional apparatus was designed to normalize this suffering. Rules and routines enforced isolation, obedience, and secrecy. Sisters and administrators wielded their authority as psychological weapons, convincing mothers that resistance was sinful, futile, or socially ruinous. Even children who survived the homes were subjected to harsh labor, deprivation, and surveillance, learning early that their voices were meaningless against the machinery of the state and church. Hidden records, destroyed correspondence, and erased files make it nearly impossible to reconstruct the full scope. Yet forensic evidence, survivor testimonies, and investigative journalism piece together a mosaic of horror. Each new excavation, each recovered document, adds weight to the undeniable truth. This was not a collection of isolated incidents, but a systematic, organized campaign of child abduction, psychological manipulation, and moral suppression. As we navigate this darkness, it becomes clear that the missing children of Ireland represent more than tragedy. They are symbols of societal complicity, of a system willing to sacrifice innocence to preserve power. It is in the faces of survivors, in the quiet confessions and the long-suppressed memories, that we begin to confront the reality of institutional corruption. Their stories demand acknowledgement, their pain demands exposure. Comment below with your location, and join this collective effort to bear witness. Because only through recognition, testimony, and confrontation can the silent horrors of Tuam begin to be addressed and the hidden machinery of abuse exposed to the light of public scrutiny. The earth at Tuam conceals secrets no one was meant to unearth. Beneath the surface, archaeologists discovered anomalous small depressions, uneven soil, clusters of shapes detectable only through modern scanning technology. Tony Maguire's work revealed the skeletal remnants of hundreds of children buried in secrecy in a place once considered sacred. These were not accidental deaths, not random misfortune. They were the culmination of a system that treated human life as expendable, governed by a combination of religious dogma, bureaucratic indifference, and societal fear. The graves, once hidden beneath grass and earth, tell a story of concealment. Measurements indicate a network of red brick tunnels, connecting old septic tanks, forming subterranean corridors where bodies were methodically placed, stacked, and then covered. It is impossible to ignore the deliberate engineering of this horror, the meticulous care taken to hide evidence while maintaining an appearance of normalcy above ground. Witnesses, children who survived, recount the stench, the silence, the eerie rituals that took place around these burial sites. Their recollections, once dismissed as fantasies or exaggerations, are corroborated by forensic analysis. Anomalies in the soil, remnants of clothing, fragments of tiny bones. Scientific methods confirm the testimonies. There is no doubt that hundreds of children were denied a proper burial, their lives erased as if they never existed. The methodical concealment reflects a deeper psychological operation, an institutional assertion of control, where even death became a tool of obedience and suppression. Each layer of soil represents decades of secrecy. Each brick of the tunnels a testament to the deliberate orchestration of atrocity. But the story is not limited to Tuam alone. Similar patterns emerge across Ireland. Mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, orphanages where silence, coercion, and fear were instruments of authority. The pattern is unmistakable. Children removed from families, mothers silenced, identities obliterated, deaths ignored or covered up. The impact extends beyond the immediate victims, shaping generations, families fractured, histories rewritten, grief internalized. These mass graves are not only evidence of past crimes, they are mirrors reflecting the moral corruption embedded in systems that prioritized institutional reputation over human life. And yet, despite the evidence, the path to justice remains obstructed by bureaucratic inertia, political caution, and lingering influence of religious authorities. Every excavation, every report, every public revelation is met with resistance, denial, or minimization, as if acknowledging the truth threatens the very foundations of power. This is the forbidden history that Ireland has tried to bury, and yet, through science, testimony, and persistence, it begins to surface, demanding recognition, demanding confrontation, demanding accountability. Comment below, are you watching from? Let your presence here be a declaration that the hidden truths of Tuam are no longer invisible. Survivors of the Tuam scandal carry wounds invisible to the naked eye, memories that haunt every decision, every relationship, every moment of their lives. They speak of a life stolen before it could begin, of mothers silenced, of childhoods consumed by fear and isolation. One woman recalls being torn from her family at 14, sent to a home she could not name, locked behind doors that never opened to comfort, only to punish and control. The system operated with precision, fear as a tool, obedience as currency, secrecy as law. For decades, these survivors were ignored, dismissed as troublemakers or delusional. Yet their stories, when pieced together, form a mosaic of institutionalized cruelty, a pattern that stretches across the island. Each story reveals the calculated indifference of authorities who allowed deaths to go unrecorded, who treated infants as liabilities to be erased rather than lives to be protected. Families were left in silence, mothers shamed, fathers absent, communities coerced into complicity by cultural and religious pressure. Some survivors speak of names they never knew, siblings they never met, bodies they never saw yet could feel lingering in the back of their minds, psychic imprint of collective trauma. The psychological control extended beyond physical walls. Guilt, shame, and fear were weaponized to suppress rebellion, to maintain hierarchy, to shield those in power from accountability. Even today, survivors recount nightmares, flashbacks, and a sense of unresolved injustice, a society that refuses to fully acknowledge the crimes. Legal avenues exist but are labyrinthine, slow, and often fruitless. Public outrage is fragmented, diluted by time and bureaucracy, yet the truth persists in the soil, in archives, in whispered testimonies, demanding recognition. Families are left to reconstruct their histories from fragments, baptismal records, letters, and photographs that hint at lives extinguished before they began. Each excavation, each acknowledgement, each memorial becomes a small act of defiance against the deliberate erasure of these children. And as you watch, understand that the echoes of Tuam are not confined to Ireland, they reverberate globally. A warning of what happens when institutions prioritize ideology over humanity. We see in Tuam the extreme consequences of unchecked authority, of morality twisted into control, of innocence sacrificed to reputation. It is a mirror of power corrupted and a call to vigilance. The survivors' voices, once silenced, now rise with urgency, demanding that history be confronted, not hidden. Now, as you sit there watching this story unfold, let the weight of this history sink in. Comment below twice. The hidden will rise to mark your acknowledgement of this forbidden truth, to declare that you will witness what others sought to erase, to recognize the injustice that lingers still. These are not mere stories, they are warnings, histories, cries for justice, and challenges to anyone who believes silence is safety. The earth of Tuam still holds secrets no one was meant to uncover. Graves unmarked, names unspoken, children erased by design. Yet history refuses to stay buried. It seeps through the cracks of memory, archives, and testimony, demanding recognition. As you watch this, imagine the weight of decades of silence. Decades in which institutions cloaked in faith and authorities' bureaucracy over humanity, ideology over compassion. Imagine the children, nameless, lifeless, their bodies reduced to numbers on paper, their humanity denied, their parents stripped of rights, love, and closure. These homes, these graves, these records are more than relics. They are evidence of a system perfected to hide, to manipulate, to dominate. Survivors speak cautiously, their voices carrying the tremor of trauma. Yet the clarity of truth pierces through fear. Children were stolen. Lives were manipulated. Death was concealed. And society was complicit. Some dared to investigate, to map the mass graves, to collect fragments of evidence hidden under grass, under brick, under time itself. Archaeologists, journalists, and family members risked ridicule, harassment, and dismissal to give names to the nameless, to restore dignity to what was taken. And still, the struggle continues. Governments issue commissions, promises are made. But systemic inertia and cultural reverence for authority delay accountability. What Tuam exposes is not only the horrors of a single institution, is a reflection of power unchecked, of morality weaponized, of societies conditioned to obey rather than question. It asks a question that lingers. How many other truths lie buried? How many children were forgotten? How many mothers silenced? How many histories erased? You are not a passive observer. You are now part of this revelation, a witness to what the world once tried to hide. Understand that confronting forbidden history is not comfortable, it is destabilizing. It challenges beliefs, it confronts conscience, but it is necessary. Every grave exposed, every name restored, every story told weakens the fortress of silence that protected the guilty for decades. This is why the work continues, and why voices like yours matter. To demand justice, to insist on memory, to honor the lives stolen. If you feel the weight of this story, let it move you, share it, discuss it. Awaken others to the hidden truths that linger in plain sight. Like, share, subscribe, and ensure that this story, and others like it, are never forgotten. Let Tuam be a warning, a call to vigilance, and a testament to the resilience of truth. Because when history is hidden, humanity suffers. When truth is revealed, justice, even if delayed, becomes inevitable. And for the children of Tuam, perhaps at last, it will be their moment to rest. Acknowledged, remembered, and mourned with dignity.